Hello everybody and welcome to today's webinar. Good morning, afternoon or evening, depending on where you are joining us from today. It's currently afternoon here in the UK. Welcome to our webinar on developing learners' thinking and working scientifically skills. I'm Laura Rogers from Cambridge University Press and Assessment, and I'll be hosting this webinar for our speaker, Alan Cross. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi there, just wanted to say hi as people are joining us. Thanks, Laura, sorry for interrupting, but yeah, really great to see lots of people joining this webinar.
Not a problem, thank you, Alan. I'm just going to give attendees a little bit of time now to join us before we get started. So if you would like to chat to one another or say hello to myself and Alan, and also my other colleagues who are on the call, please do use the chat box. And it would be great to know where you're joining us from today. So just for those of you who are just joining, thank you for joining us for our webinar on developing learners' thinking and working scientifically skills. I'm Laura Rogers from Cambridge University Press and Assessment, and I will be hosting this webinar for our speaker, Alan Cross. While we wait for a few more attendees to join us, I'm going to briefly explain how we are going to run this webinar. We are recording the webinar today to share with you afterwards, so don't worry if your internet drops out during the session or if you miss any key points, just rejoin us as soon as you can, and then you can also catch up on anything that you've missed in the recording afterwards. If you're having trouble with your speakers, we suggest using headphones or checking that your speakers aren't muted. Your microphones and cameras will remain off throughout the webinar. If you have any technical issues or questions about the session as we go through, please can you put those in the chat box, and you will see that my colleagues Tamsin, Elaine and Eddie will be on hand to help you. Please can you put any questions you have for our speaker in the Q&A box. And Alan will be answering as many as possible in the Q&A time we have at the end of the session. Days after the webinar, we will send you an email with a link to the webinar recording and information on where you can find the webinar slides. If we don't have time to get to your questions during the live session, we will be also providing responses to frequently asked questions on our Brighter Thinking blog afterwards, which we will also share the link with you in the follow-up email. Unfortunately, we cannot provide certificates for the session. However, you can use your email as proof of attendance. That's the end of our introduction. Thank you once again for joining the session, and we hope that you enjoy the webinar and take away lots of fantastic teaching ideas. I'd now like to hand over to Alan, who is going to lead the session today.
Laura, thank you so much. Thanks for covering all of those useful things in that introduction. And again, a very, very warm welcome to people that I can see that have joined us, saying hello in the chat box. And we can see that people from a considerable range of countries are joining us. From Nigeria through to Egypt and over to India, Pakistan and Thailand, and I'm sure I've missed many out. China, I can see, in Indonesia. So welcome to everybody. And I'll just talk you through what I'm going to be doing in the next half hour so that we are really clear about the webinar and what we're covering here. I'll just move on another screen. Yes, just an introduction about myself. I have been working with Cambridge for probably 15 or more years now. My background is in teaching. I am a teacher, worked for many years as a teacher. In fact, last week I was in a school as part of our National Science Week, teaching children in grade 2, it was in fact. I'm also a writer, and I was lucky enough to be part of the team that wrote the Cambridge science scheme, the primary science scheme And I have with me the lower secondary materials as well. So I'm used to training both primary and lower secondary teachers who are working on the scheme. So with the scheme. So great to have you here. Great to have the opportunity to talk about this super resource. These are our objectives for the session. Around about half an hour, taking you through some of the key elements of the Cambridge science curriculum, the primary and lower secondary science curriculum. We'll have a look at the Cambridge science materials, the CUP science materials, look at some of the features of those as they relate to teaching and working scientifically. That's our real focus in this session. And we'll be finishing off with about 20 minutes of me describing some pedagogical approaches to thinking and working scientifically. And I'm aware that some of you will be teaching face-to-face, many of you hopefully, but some will be teaching online. So if you have questions about online teaching, you might save those for the Q&A box, which you can access now, or for the Q&A session at the end of this session that I'm doing. And I do realize that some of you will have many resources and be well resourced, but some schools will perhaps be quite short in terms of resources. So I'm quite happy to talk about that. I will mention that. And again, thanks to Laura, who's co-hosting the session, but I also do have Elaine, Tasmin and Eddie, who may well contribute during the session, and particularly at the end, colleagues from Cambridge University Press. So welcome to you. I wanted to show you this screen because it's one that we use when we're talking about the Cambridge resources, and we talk about these 6 very important elements. I'm not going to read them all to you, but it starts on the left with active learning, then assessment for learning, and we've got other things that there like skills for life and metacognition. And these are all key parts of the Cambridge approach. The one that we're going to refer to most in this session is active learning. And active learning is all about learners being very involved in their own learning. And the great thing we have in science is thinking and working mathematically, which is, scientifically, thinking and working scientifically, because that really is a key into active learning. So just a word more or two on active learning, some words here. It's about learners actually engaging in their learning, in the learning process, and them responding to the opportunities that are given to them by their teacher to develop lifelong learning. So we're interested in learning science knowledge, but we're very interested in these skills that are going to be with learners for years and years to come. And as teachers, we know that those are essential and very important. And we know that learners learn more when they're talking. And we might think about active learning as actually thinking. Many people misunderstand this term, and they think that the active learning is about the children doing things, being active. Well, it does include that, but it's actually to do with them using their brain and thinking. And one of the ways that we ensure that we can see that learners are thinking and developing is getting them talking. And this is a real top tip for me, that if you want learners to really develop this thinking, these thinking skills, get them talking about the science, talking to one another about the science. And of course, you will be involved in those discussions. But there's a lot of evidence that shows when children are talking to one another, they learn more. So just moving on. This is a little summary of the main strands of the 2021 Cambridge curriculum that we're using. And you can see that it includes 6 strands of the content and that is in the curriculum. And you'll immediately recognize in the middle of that list, biology, chemistry, and physics. Those are headings that we're very used to in science education, and they cover an awful lot of the content. But Cambridge have very sensibly included an Earth in Space strand. I put it there, you'll see it in the list next to physics because that's where it belongs, but it's now a separate strand. And this has happened because Cambridge asked teachers all around the world, and they said that they wanted more emphasis on earth and space. And so we've got those content strands that I've just referred to: biology, chemistry, physics, and earth and space. But at the top, our focus today, this very important strand of thinking and working scientifically. And really, again, lots of research evidence that shows that if you teach the content through the medium of thinking and working scientifically, through children thinking and doing their own science, then the children learn more effectively and they remember what they've learned for longer. It has a real positive impact. Now, at the bottom of there is the sixth strand that I must refer to, and that is science in context. And this isn't new to most teachers, because we often talk to children about the context of the science. So we'll be talking about gravity, and we'll talk about space flight. We'll be talking about forces, and we'll talk about playgrounds that the children know. So we're very interested, and Cambridge want to encourage us to include science in context. One reason I want to emphasize today thinking and working scientifically is for those schools who adopt the Cambridge curriculum and who use the checkpoint tests, then in the future, 25% of marks will come from thinking and working scientifically. So if you want your learners to do well in any kind of assessment, including the checkpoint tests, then you really do need to emphasize thinking and working scientifically so that the children learn about that. But the double positive effect is that the learners will learn even more of the science, and they'll remember things for longer. So it's really important to emphasize that in the classrooms where you're teaching. This is another version of what we've just seen, to be honest, but you'll see this in lots of the Cambridge documentation, this particular graphic, with, again, the blue arrows in the middle of that graphic representing the content, and the black arrow, which weaves its way across the blue arrows, is the strand thinking and working scientifically. And what we're looking at there represents the fact that thinking and working scientifically needs to really integrate into all of these content areas: biology, chemistry, physics, earth and space, so that learners, whenever they're learning any science, are also engaged with thinking and working scientifically. And Cambridge have written the objectives for that really, really well. I'm very impressed with this new curriculum. And there you'll see the blue circle, because all of this is included if you're a maths teacher, if you like, this is a universal set, and everything that we've mentioned there relates to science in context, and relating everything to the real world, which is what good teachers have always done, but now the curriculum really encourages us to do that. So if we think about thinking and working scientifically, this graphic, this screen shows us how it's broken down in the curriculum. And really, this is quite innovative, the way the curriculum has been structured in this way. 4 sections: models and representations, and then 3 sections referring to science inquiry, purpose and planning, carrying out the inquiry, and the analysis, evaluation, and conclusions. Not unfamiliar language to science teachers, to those of us who teach science, but of course, models and representations hasn't been represented and encouraged in this way before. So this is the first thing we're going to look at. Let's have a look at some common models and representations that we're used to using. And if I start over on the right-hand side of the screen, you've got a diagram there of a flower with labels and some description of definition of what those words mean. And that will be very familiar to all of us who've studied science or teach science. We've got a model, it's a representation, and it helps us learn. In the middle of the screen, you can see some learners are working with a book. They've got a book on the right-hand side, but they're creating their own model, their own representation of the digestive system, the inside, the organs of the human body. They're cutting out paper and making that model. Top left, we've got a food web. You would use that in lower secondary to represent feeding relationships. In primary, you talk about just a line of those from plants to rabbit to the hawk in a food chain. with the arrows showing us how the energy passes from plants to the rabbit and from the rabbit to the hawk. And you might do that in relation to animals and plants that the children are more familiar with in your locality. Down on the bottom left-hand side, we've got a photograph from a classroom, and those are primary age children representing a circuit. So they are standing in a circle and they are moving in one direction as if they were electrons. And the teacher will be talking to them about what happens in a circuit, what happens if we break the circuit, and then the children will go on to make circuits, electrical circuits in class. You can see a symbol there for the switch and a symbol for a cell. And these are the models and representations. Now, the important point is that we have always used these kind of models in science, and we've used them in teaching science. But what Cambridge want us to do now is they want us to talk to the children about the model and how the model is helping the children learn, and importantly, whether the model has any shortcomings. So, for example, the inside of human body isn't made out of paper and it isn't two-dimensional. It's three-dimensional. So that might be a shortcoming that you might talk about. And when we're modeling electrons moving in a circle or a circuit, rather, they don't move slowly as children would in the one that we saw there. The electrons are moving much more quickly. And we can talk to children about how the model helps us learn, but how the model is only a model and will have shortcomings, as they all do. Moving on, I've got an example here of another model which is used in schools. And you can see here the children are using something that looks like a parachute and small balls. And we do have here a little bit of video that we can watch because this was filmed by my co-author, John Board. You'll see his name on the books. And you'll see here the children are doing a model of solids, liquids and gases, the particle model. So they're barely moving the balls.
They're moving a little bit, but not going around. Excellent. Now a liquid, so they move around each other.
So now we're getting more energy. The particles are moving in relation to one another.
And now a gas.
So, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to jump on there. So thanks to John and thanks to those children. We've got permission to use those pictures and video. That's a really good example of a model. But importantly, we need to talk to the children about how that helps them understand the idea of solids, liquids and gases, or with older learners, particles. But what about the shortcomings of that model and whether it works in every instance? But of course, you can use similar models to do and introduce all sorts of other ideas in the particle model of matter. So moving on. Oh, really just reiterating here, this is an illustration from one of the lower secondary books. Again, a model representation and asking that question. So we're using models in a much more active way, and that's what Cambridge are asking us to do with that. So just back to this graphic for a second that we looked at a moment ago. We've been looking at models and representations, and now we're going to think about those three subsections that we referred to, which are different parts of science inquiry. And a particular point that I want to make here, just looking at this screen, planning, that's going to be an important part of children learning about science inquiry. So planning in pairs and in groups, working together. I'll suggest some ideas for this later. Then carrying out the inquiry and then thinking. And those important three stages, that last one often gets missed, or it often gets very little time because the children have spent so long carrying out the science inquiry that the lesson runs out of time for the analysis and for the conclusions. And I really would say to you, do what I do. And when I'm planning a lesson, I really do make a point of making time for that last section and then making the time in the lesson. And if for any reason we miss it in a lesson, then I'll make time for that in a lesson that follows, because it is so important. I might even say it's the most important part of the lesson, part of that sequence. But just another thing to say on this, and this relates to the curriculum. The Cambridge curriculum asks that each year the learners encounter 5 different types of science inquiry. Now, this doesn't apply to grade 1 and grade 2, to stage 1 and stage 2. So the youngest learners don't have to do these 5 in the year. They might, in fact, it's a very good idea, and they will do more than one of these, no question about that. But by the time we get to grade 3, to stage 3, then we really, it's effectively part of the curriculum that they have to do this. And so each half term, as a science teacher, I would be making sure we did at least one or a couple of those, and then come back to them again in another half term, in another term, so that by the end of the term, the children are really familiar with different ways of researching, fair testing, observing over time, identifying, classifying, and pattern seeking. And if you want to find out more about that, if you search online for Jane Turner and an article she wrote called "It's Not Fair," and the research that she and her colleagues did influenced Cambridge, and hence we have this excellent idea, which is brilliantly supported in the CUP materials. The CUP materials will do this for you, because the other authors and I had this very much in mind as we were designing the materials to make sure that these different types of inquiry crop up time and time again in the materials in the year. And just referring to the materials there, we've got these on screen. You can see across the top there some of the lower secondary materials, and across the bottom of the screen the primary materials. And in each case we have learners' books. I have them by my side here. I've got a primary and lower secondary, very well produced, real great resources, ones that I keep, even though I was writing these, I keep them by my side because I know they're packed with brilliant ideas for the classroom. I know that children love them. I've shared them with children, and they've had a fabulous response. So very well produced. But as well as the learner's book, we have the teacher's resource. Again, I've got one of those here. And I should just say that 1 or 2 schools tend to focus their purchasing on the learner's book. That's understandable. But I do meet teachers when I talk to them around the world who haven't come across the teacher's resource that I'm holding here. And I have to say, this is an incredibly useful investment, and I'll refer to it in a moment or two again. But just refer now to the workbook that you'll have available for the different grades. And in primary, there's an additional resource you can see there over on the right-hand side of the screen, the electronic resources, the digital classroom, and the resource that we have in secondary science, the English language skills booklet. Really incredibly useful resources. And in each case of the learner's book, teacher resource, and the workbook, each of those, when you buy those, each of those comes with extra digital resources. So they really are, a very sound investment, I would say, for any school. So yeah, do have a good look at those. I'm sure we'll talk about those later on, and make sure that you have the resources that you need in school. Yes, the teacher's resource I was going to refer to here. You can see that list that I'm not going to read to you, but there are planning resources there, things to assist you with your planning, focus on the teaching of skills, including the skills of thinking and working scientifically. And I always emphasize, I've emphasized it in red, the learning intentions and success criteria. And I've popped those up, an example there on the screen, where the authors have taken learning objectives directly from the curriculum. I hope you can see them in the left-hand column there. and then rewritten those into learning intentions that the learners would comprehend, so the kind of language that learners would comprehend, and then also success criteria, which can be used at any point in the lesson, but particularly at the end of the lesson, can assist the children in determining, yeah, have I been successful in this lesson? Now, those aren't easy to write, and I think it's a fabulous thing that we've got those in the teacher's resource available for you. You can adapt them, of course, if you can think of a more appropriate wording, but that job is done for you, and that will save you time, as will all the other resources here, the activity guides. There are guides for additional activities if you want more activities. There's advice about children's misconceptions and how to support the children's language, because of course many children are learning in English, but it's not their first language, and that's very important to think about and to have resources available for that. So yes, I'll move on. We're doing well, just glancing at the time. We're actually on time, that's good, working our way through some screens about the fabulous Cambridge University Press resources. And we've got a couple of screenshots here which give you an idea of how the learners' books introduce the different topics. So there are a couple of pages on the left from the primary resources and a couple of pages on the right from the lower secondary resources, but they include similar elements. You can see a green introductory box entitled "We Are Going To," and this is about, you know, what are we going to be learning in this unit, and then a box which is red, which is a getting started box, and this is a prompt for the teacher to use to find out what the learners already know. It's very, very important to find out what they already know and think about a topic, because that will help you in your teaching. And of course, it might save you time if you discover that they actually know some of the content that you were planning to teach. Then that'll save you some time, and you can spend more time on the aspects that perhaps they find difficult, or spend more time on thinking and working scientifically. Now, that element is represented in the purple box that you can see on the screens there, because we have this element called Think Like a Scientist. And what we've done here, the authors have designed activities specifically to teach some of the content, but through the medium of thinking and working scientifically. And I have to say, this element works extremely well and really does empower the teachers and enable the learners to be physically doing things, but more importantly, thinking about what they're doing. So they're thinking about the concepts, and they're thinking about the science process, and working like a scientist. I think we'll see one or two more of those in a second. There is another orange box there with keywords in it, and in the learners books you will find other elements. Apologies that I'm not covering absolutely everything in this session. Yes, more examples there from I think primary, those grade 3, stage 3 and stage 6, different examples of these Think Like a Scientist activities. And those are well supported in the teacher's resource book, so that any teacher teaching those will have really good advice, lots of practical tips on how to the children might, learners might approach these activities. So I'm going to move now to different pedagogical approaches, some of which are from the teacher's resource. So it'll give you some idea of the kind of things that are mentioned in the teacher resource. And I think I'm going to mention one or two extras that I've just kind of put in today. But I think it's true, actually, that I'm just looking at all of these. In fact, almost all of these are in the teacher resource. So, and the teacher resource has many, many more really, really great resources. So I was talking a moment ago about learning intentions. And I find around the world, many teachers know that these are important, but they don't always share them with the learners at the beginning of the lesson. And I would say that it is, well, a top tip from me, but I would say it's absolutely essential that either right at the start or within a minute or two of starting, you might start with an activity just to get the learners tuned in to the topic, But quite soon, within the first 5-10 minutes of the lesson, you share with them what this lesson's about. We refer to these learning intentions. So it might be that in this lesson, we're going to be learning about different circuits and switches, for example, so that the learners know what the lesson is about. But my top tip is to always have at least 2 learning intentions for every lesson. One of them covering the content, and I've just given you an example of that. But the second one covers an aspect of thinking and working scientifically. This has a number of very positive effects. So the second one might be, for example, that we're going to be designing a fair test, or we're going to do an observation over time, or that we're going to learn to measure force, or we're going to learn to measure amps using an ammeter. Whatever it is, I think it's useful, in fact, very, very powerful, to stress the content of what you're covering, but also a thinking, workingly science skill, a thinking and working scientifically learning objective. This will help you as a teacher to focus on both of those things in your teaching. If you're lucky enough to have other adults helping you in a classroom, they'll be clear about what the lesson's about. But the most important group in the room are the students, and this will help them to tune into what are we doing. And I would look at these at the beginning of the lesson, but I'd also look at the learning intentions at the end of the lesson. And as an assessment activity, we might determine whether the lesson's been successful or not. I love it when my lesson's successful, but do you know, sometimes I learn it even more when I discover that not all the learners have got it. So what I then can do is, as a skilled teacher, I can readdress that, I can revisit it, do it in a slightly different way, and hopefully by reapproaching it in a different way, make sure that I get everybody on board. And yes, we are all about our learners being very successful and really learning their science. And as I said at the beginning, if learners think their science through thinking and working scientifically, then they're more likely to learn more and remember it for longer. This is a nice approach. I know this is in the scheme because I wrote it into the teacher's resource. 10 questions approach, very simple, requires a little bit of confidence on your part as teacher. So if you're new to teaching, you might save this one for later. If you're new to teaching with Cambridge, you might save it. But as you get more confidence, it's a lovely approach, works very, very well. What you're going to do is you reveal to the learners that we're doing a new topic, for example, on the senses, and you get them to individually, or even better in pairs, write a question that they have about the human senses. Collect those questions in, share them with the class, and then select 1 or 2 that you can investigate as a class, or if you wish, you could have groups looking at different questions. You can see there in the middle a few examples from a lesson that I taught on the sense of smell. The children asked questions like, how far away can we smell things? And why can dogs smell so well? Or can people with big noses smell better? Can elephants smell things better? Are some people better at smelling than others? Well, you've probably already realized that there are a couple of those that I couldn't possibly, in fact, the 3 in the middle, I couldn't really possibly take forward into class. Bringing animals into the classroom isn't advised unless they're very small, maybe invertebrates that are very safe. And referring to people with big noses, well, that's not very polite, and not something we'd encourage. But the top question and the bottom question were both questions that we took forward, and I got the children to design investigations to answer those questions. And they did, carried them out, and we got some great science out of that. a little tip there is to just have a few things prepared yourself in case your learners don't come up with too many ideas. If it's the first time you've ever done this approach, then they might find it a little bit difficult. You'll find that with all of these things. The first time you do this in the classroom, some of the learners find it a little bit challenging, but then when you repeat it, they get more familiar and they get more confident. So we didn't have 10 questions, there were only 5, but I just call it the 10 questions approach. Hoping we're going to come up with 10. This is another brilliant idea. It is mentioned in the teacher's resource more than once, and this is using science badges. The idea is that learners find it difficult to work in groups. Often teachers give up in despair when they assign groups to do tasks and you see that one learner is doing a lot of the work and the others are opting out, or one learner takes over and dominates. All sorts of things. So this gets around that. What we do is we give, in this case, the 5 children in the group, they each get a badge. One of them is the leader. One of them does the measuring. One does the recording. One does the testing. And one of them asks questions. Now, you can change these badges around. In fact, you could get your learners to design their own set of badges. But these have proved in every school that I've introduced these, people have taken this idea on board. It's been very, very popular, very, very effective. Children get different roles. And then next time we do science, we swap the roles round. So they get to try out a different role. And these are adapted by teachers, but works very, very well. And it really does get the learners thinking and working scientifically, because this is how scientists work. Scientists tend to work in teams. Really nice approach, pedagogical approach, works with almost every age range. Well, it's worked with every age range I've tried it with. I perhaps could say that I've not personally tried it with stage 1, grade 1, but every other grade it's worked right the way through to grade 8 and 9. So, this is a nice one. It's got a very primary feel to it, but I'll just say something about that. This is the idea of using a character, in this case, a puppet, in which case you might say to the learners, well, here's our puppet. We might give him a name or her a name. We'll call this teddy bear Alan. So let's teach Alan about forces, or let's teach Alan about plate tectonics, or whatever it is. So we're going to prepare materials in our activities, and then we're going to explain it to the character. Another approach that I've used very effectively is to imagine that the character, the puppet in this case, has a misconception. So, for example, this puppet might say, yes, I think that light can travel round corners. And by the way, I don't mean light traveling when it's refracted or with a mirror, but light traveling from a source to a destination. We know it travels in straight lines, but the puppet, the character, says that, no, I think it can go around corners. So the learners are challenged with an activity, an investigation where they can prove this is wrong, or indeed prove it right if it's looked at a slightly different way. So really nice activity. I've got my science monkey here that I take into schools with me. He says that he's really enjoying the webinar so far, and he's so excited to see so many teachers who were interested in thinking and working scientifically. But no, now if you're working with older learners, you can introduce another character, which might be the head of science in the school, or the head teacher in the school, or a local person that the children know, a scientist maybe from the media. They might prepare a letter, a report that they're going to send to somebody. The key thing is that they've got an audience, and that they're then able to talk together and think together and present an idea, explaining it clearly. And as you probably know, children find explaining quite difficult. It's the thing that they find really challenging. Now, just moving on, This is a great idea for, I would say, every science lab or every classroom where science is taught to have, well, you could call it a science working wall or a thinking and working scientifically working wall. If I was a science specialist, I'd almost certainly have a thinking and working scientifically working wall, but any teacher can have it. And on your working wall, this would be, you know, a reasonably sized wall in the classroom, but you would have posters, for example, with the vocabulary that we're using, the vocabulary of thinking and working scientifically. You can take that from the curriculum. There are vocabulary lists in the learners' books and in the teachers' resources. You might turn this into a glossary. It might be a glossary where you provide the definitions, but it might be even better if the children can, the learners can write their own definitions of these words, these science terms that you're using. You might, on the working wall, have a writing frame for science, and we're going to look at one in a moment, so I won't explain what it is now. Some of you will be familiar. You might have a blank poster on the wall where you encourage learners to write their own science questions. That's, I think, a resource that should be in every classroom so that learners get the opportunity to talk about the questions that they've got. One that's not on the list would be a poster of clippings of science in the media. So when science gets mentioned in the newspapers or magazines, that's cut out and added to the science working wall, or in this case, the thinking and working scientifically working wall. It would be great to include some examples of investigation reports that your learners have written, probably some really good examples or examples from learners that you really want to encourage, and really use this working wall in your lessons. Point to the elements that are on there. I might even include my learning objectives and actually keep those there listed lesson by lesson, the learning objectives that we've been achieving, so that I can keep reminding the learners what we've been doing in the topic. Photographs of, well, any kind of photographs, of course, and you might refer to famous scientists, people who have contributed to science. And whenever I do that, I try to make that very inclusive with people, for example, European scientists or African scientists or scientists for other parts of the world, men and women, really make that very, very inclusive so that everybody feels, yes, I can see myself being a scientist. And I love it when my teacher asks me to work scientifically. I know that many of you know this, and yes, that is good practice. This is an example of a writing frame. This is a primary one. There are lots of examples of these available on the internet. This one, you can see the important stages of planning that a learner might go through. If you're introducing these to a class for the first time, I would do it as a group activity. So I'd have a big one of these on the chalkboard, on the whiteboard, on a poster, and we would work as a group, as a class, filling in sections of these so that learners become familiar with one way of approaching planning a fair test. As I say, there are more simple ones on the internet that you could find. You might even design your own. I've designed my own in the past, and ones that are more sophisticated. For example, we've got the word change on there referring to variables, and we've got there measure referring to variables. Well, you teachers of older learners would want to use the words dependent and independent, of course. Great way to introduce that language. So yeah, planning a fair test, really enabling the learners, giving them resources so that they can increasingly take responsibility for this. And I'm going to mention that again in a moment. This is a nice idea, and when I'm doing face-to-face training, this often features in the training that I do. So looking on the left-hand side of that table at the kind of questions that the youngest learners ask, but indeed all aged learners would ask. Which ball rolls best? Which coat is safe at night? What do plants need? Which material is strongest? And so on. And part of our role as a teacher is to help develop those questions into more scientific questions. So if you look at that top line, it's a nice simple example. A child might ask, which ball rolls best? And if they use that word best, that's a great opportunity for you to ask, well, what do we mean by best? Which ball rolls fastest? Which ball rolls furthest? Which ball rolls in the nicest way or over a different surface better? Now, this class decided which ball rolls furthest. So that was their question. That's a better question to develop a science investigation. And with primary children, I'd probably use that question. But if I was working with older learners, we might develop it even more. And we might ask that question on the right-hand side. How does the size of the ball affect the distance that it rolls? So we really are beginning to tune into the things that are going to be the variables and the thing that we're going to measure. So these stages and steps in planning can be very useful. You can see that I've left some sections there blank for people to have a go at themselves. So what do we mean by strongest? We all use that word, but what do we mean when we refer to a material and so on? So yeah, that's another great, I think, pedagogical activity, and is going to develop this skill of asking and developing questions, which is an important part of thinking and working scientifically. So just moving on a little bit now. This is a big one, actually. It looks simple, but it's probably the toughest one of these that I'm going to refer to. And it's all about shifting the control in the classroom. When I began teaching, I understood that it was my role to stand at the chalkboard. That's how old I am. We had chalkboards in those days. Now it will be a whiteboard or an interactive whiteboard. But it was my job to stand at the front and explain things. Yes, give tasks and activities to the learners, but very much I was in control. I would give instructions. And so I didn't realize that I was setting a glass ceiling because I was doing so much of the work in the classroom. The learners weren't getting the opportunity to be creative and suggest ideas and try things out and fail and then have success. And those important parts where they need to discuss with their children around them and make decisions. So I was robbing them of that opportunity. Now, I had an interesting experience around about the 1990s when I did my PhD. And one of the things, what I was doing in my PhD, I was observing STEM lessons. So STEM is science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. I was observing those lessons. And one thing that I discovered in my conclusion was that the most effective lessons were those lessons when the teacher gave up control. So the teacher gave some of the control of the lesson to the children. So allowed the children to make choices, allowed the children to plan, allowed the children to take control of parts of the lesson. Of course, the teacher is still in control. The teacher has to be. But one of the big things about an experienced teacher that can really develop teaching is this shift that you can make. Initially, it might be a simple thing where you allow the children to select the equipment that they're going to use, or they might select a question that they're going to answer. But step by step, you can hand over more control. This reminds me of the words of a good friend of mine who's a local successful head teacher. And she always says this to her teachers: make the children work harder than you. So it's not just for the teacher to be working hard in the class. You will be, of course, but we need the learners to be working hard. And when we have them working hard, what we mean is this: active learning, where they're engaged in their own learning, they're thinking about the things that they're learning, and they're taking some control of that. And they'll be much more engaged by lessons where they are taking control. And in science, we're so lucky. We are so lucky because we've got thinking and working scientifically. And it is the perfect vehicle for this. And as I've said all along, this is all incredibly well supported by the Cambridge University Press materials, where we really have included the sort of things that I'm talking about, and encourage teachers to think about ways to give learners more and more responsibility in their science classes. So do think about that. Think about the other things that I've been suggesting. Think about that as an approach. I'm coming to the final slide in this section before we move towards our question and answer. So if you've got questions, don't hesitate to pop those in the Q&A box or make a note of them, and we can use them later on. And I wanted to just refer to this. I refer to differentiation as a big word. And differentiation is all about tailoring the lesson to the learners, designing the lesson so that it suits the learners. And you won't be surprised to see that at the bottom, I'm saying that we can use thinking and working scientifically. But let me look at just some of the other words there at the moment. Most teachers, I think this is true to say, most teachers will differentiate by task. And by that, I mean, they will give slightly different tasks to different groups. So if there's a group that is challenged, that lacks confidence, they may get a simpler, more straightforward version of the task. Learners who are generally confident will get a version of the task. And learners who are more confident, more capable, may be given a more challenging task. And that's a perfectly reasonable approach. But it's not the only approach. And another approach that I would advocate very strongly in classrooms, particularly in the first lesson or at the beginning of a lesson, is differentiation by outcome, whereby we ask the learners all to do the same activity. So that reduces your workload. They're all doing the same activity, but of course they respond differently. And as you observe them and assess them in their work, you'll find that some are more confident and get more done in a more effective way, and some do struggle. So that in your first lesson, for example, you use that to find out what the learners know and how confident they are about this. And you can then reintroduce more differentiation by task, but also differentiation by adult support, differentiation by resources, differentiation by expectation. Those 5 bullet points came from a research called Dewhurst. I'm very sad to say I've lost the reference now, but I remember the name and I've used them for years. Those 5 forms of differentiation, but remembering that differentiation by outcome is legitimate, particularly in your first lesson on a new topic or at the beginning of any lesson, so that everybody gets the chance to shine and to do what they, if we only ever use the top one, if they only ever do differentiation by task, we create a glass ceiling in the classroom, and some learners don't ever get the opportunity to really shine in science. So I hope you don't mind me just referring to that for a moment, but I do want to emphasize that a great way to differentiate in science lessons is through thinking and working scientifically. And in many ways, it includes the words above in the 5 bullets above, because what we can do in any science lesson, it might be to do with life cycles, food webs, whatever it is that we're doing. But we might want to give some learners more challenge in the thinking and working scientifically. And that challenge might come from being more independent, giving them more control so they really become in charge of the science that they're doing. The learners in the class who need more support, who are less confident, are finding the topic challenging, then we would include more adult support, more support with resources, and maybe more realistic expectations for them. But that as I said before, this marvelous pot of gold that we have in science called thinking and working scientifically helps us in so many ways. It helps the learners to learn the science, to be keen and enthusiastic about science, and it gives us opportunities like this as teachers to differentiate. So we're coming to a close there. Thanks for your attention so far. I know that my colleagues are on standby. I'll just move to the final screen here. And I mean, I will be saying goodbye at the end of the Q&A session, but thank you for your attention. I hope you found things interesting there, pedagogical ideas, but this idea that the CUP materials really give you all this, either in the learner's books or in the teacher's resource or the other fantastic resources that are provided. So yeah, thanks and good luck. And we can move to any questions that people might have. And Laura, I can see, is with us. Thank you, Laura.
Yes, thank you so much, Alan, for a fantastic presentation. Some really interesting ideas there and some great approaches for how to use the resources as well. And I saw that lots of our participants loved the puppet idea and the idea for the vocabulary wall. And it was really great to see all of your enthusiasm for the teaching ideas. So now I think we have a little bit of time for a couple of questions, but don't worry, if we don't get to your question, we will provide as much information as we can in the follow-up communications. And I also know that my colleagues have been answering as many as they can throughout the session as well. So that's great, and thank you very much for doing that. So we did have a question towards the start of the presentation. You shared a really interesting diagram of how the thinking and working scientifically principles should be applied across all of the strands in the curriculum and be grounded in the science context. And we had a question about whether the resources cover all 6 strands of the curriculum and whether there are ideas included throughout the resources that apply the thinking and working scientifically principles across all the strands.
Yes, they do. Yes, we do cover all of the content of the curriculum, all the strands of the curriculum, the 6 strands, because we felt that was very, very much the point of a scheme like this. And the author team, the 8 authors, really were from the start very, very committed to these elements. So yes, all of that is there. And thinking, working scientifically, as I said, features in the learner's books through the Think Like a Scientist feature, but also that's backed up every time with advice in the teacher's resource. So it really does work well. So I think I've answered that, Laura.
Yes, great. Thank you, Alan. So another question we have from Joanna Chong. How do you do assessment at the end of the class to find out about the students' progress? And Eddie did also respond with some information on the assessment opportunities that are found within the resources. But I wondered if you had anything you wanted to add on that question.
Oh, golly, yes. Let's do another webinar on assessment. Fantastic. Right, okay. I was mentioning learning intentions in the power and the presentation, and I'll come back to that. Learning intentions are very important to share at the beginning of the session. At least one about content and at least one about thinking and working scientifically. Once the learners know those learning intentions and you've got them clear in your head, you can then refer to those at the end of the lesson. You can do a simple thumbs up, thumbs in the middle, thumbs down. Children, do we think we've achieved that first learning intention? In addition to that will be the resources that Eddie's spoken about, because at the back of each unit in the learner's book, there are quiz type questions for the learners to try out. We've also got, if you buy the teacher's resource, you also get electronically a whole set of assessment materials for each unit. You get a diagnostic test, which is to help you at the beginning of the unit, a mid-unit test and an end-of-unit test. You can use them as tests or quizzes or whatever. Eddie, do please feel to come in if I've missed anything. But really, we've provided a lot of resources for assessment.
Fantastic, thank you, Alan.
I was just going to add, since Alan invited me, Laura, sorry, apologies. Just to say that we've made assessment a real focus in this new edition and it's one of the big changes I think you'll see with the original edition. So you'll find it in a lot of different guises, as Alan's just detailed, right from the way the learners' books are designed with the learning intentions, the sort of can-do statements. And if you look inside the teacher's guide, it's got a lot of assessment advice in there. It's got ideas around what, on what to spot where children perhaps are struggling and that kind of thing as well. It's got the quizzes regularly through the learner's book as well. So in terms of assessment, it runs all the way through the course, and you have a lot of opportunities.
And thank you, and that's going to save teachers an awful lot of work. It really is a fabulous resource. None of those are compulsory, of course. It's keep using the word flexible. You've got a whole range of resources at which you can draw from. Use them all, use some of them. It's up to you. Thanks, Eddie.
No problem, Mark.
Thanks, Eddie and Alan. Unfortunately, we have reached the end of our time today. But just to reassure you again, we will pick up as many of your questions as we can. We'll have them all recorded and we will be able to provide as much information as we can following the session today. I can see that there's still a lot of you on the session, so thank you so much for staying for an additional few minutes just for us to wrap up. We also do have some further primary and lower secondary webinars taking place later this week and a final session at the end of April as well. So the next one taking place is tomorrow, and this is focusing on Cambridge Primary and Lower Secondary English with Jill Budgell. So I'd recommend, if you're interested in signing up for these, quickly grab the links from the chat box where Tamsin is going to share them for us now. And you can also check on our social media platforms for these as well if you don't have time to get to the links in the chat box. Remember that 7 days after the webinar, we will send you an email with a recording of the session and inform you of where to find the webinar slides. And you can also use this email as proof that you attended the session. So to find out more about the resources discussed today, please speak to your local sales representative or visit cambridge.org/education. And these links will also be provided in the follow-up email. Now, just to give a couple more seconds for those of you who want to get the webinar links from the chat box, I'm also going to say when the webinar ends today, there is a short survey to complete that will open on your screens. And if you don't mind taking a quick 5 minutes to complete this short survey, it will really help us in understanding how we can support you moving forward so that you have as much help as you need from us and we know what we can do to help you. And the only other thing left to say is thank you very much to Alan Cross for leading our session today on primary and lower secondary science. I hope you'll all agree it was a very interesting and engaging session with lots of great ideas to take away. And thank you also to Tamsin, Elaine and Eddie for being on hand throughout the webinar and for answering your questions. So good luck with your teaching. Thank you for joining us today and goodbye for now.